Delaney Foster was on her knees, scrubbing somebody else's marble floor, when the email came through that gave her exactly 2 days to prove she deserved to keep her own little sister. She was 27, 3 jobs deep, and so tired that the buzz of her phone against the cold stone felt like a slap. Whitney was 8, asthmatic, and the only family Lane had left since the accident took their parents 2 winters back. And now the state of Georgia had decided a woman who cleaned mansions in Buckhead by day and stocked shelves by night couldn't possibly be a fit guardian. No stable address, no real income on paper, no health insurance for a child who couldn't always breathe easy. 48 hours. That was the window before a judge signed Whitney over to strangers, and Lane didn't have a dollar or a plan to stop it. What she didn't know yet was that the man who'd walk into that mansion an hour later carried more cash in his coat than she'd earn in a decade, and a colder reputation than anyone in the city dared say out loud. Killiorn Drayton was 37, built like a man who'd fought his way up from nothing and never forgot the climb, with a tailored black suit, a jaw that never softened, and eyes that had watched grown men beg without blinking once. He ran half the shadows in Atlanta, the money that got washed, the debts that got collected, the people who crossed him and didn't stay around long after. He came to that house to collect on a man who owed him, and instead he found a maid who'd seen something she was never meant to see. A maid who should have been a problem he made disappear. But when his men stepped toward her, Lane didn't scream and she didn't beg. She looked the most dangerous man in Georgia dead in the eye and asked him for 2 days not for herself, but for an 8-year-old girl with weak lungs and nobody else in the world. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, something behind that ruthless stare cracked, because Killiorn Drayton had lost a little sister of his own a long time ago, back when he was poor and powerless and no one came to help. So instead of turning her away, he made her an offer, one that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the kind of debt that can't be paid in cash. If you believe people can change, and that even the hardest hearts hide a wound worth healing, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that mercy still exists in this world, and subscribe to the channel, because you won't want to miss how this one ends. Now let's go back to that cold marble floor, 2 days on the clock, and the moment everything in Lane's life began to change. Killiorn Drayton's study was on the 2nd floor of the mansion, behind a walnut door so thick it swallowed every sound, and when that door closed behind Lane, she realized she was standing alone with the man the entire city didn't dare name. He didn't invite her to sit right away. He walked to the window, silently looked down at the perfectly trimmed garden below, then turned back and began speaking in a flat voice, cold and clear, as though he were reading from a contract that had been drafted long ago. He said he knew about her court hearing, knew about Whitney, and knew about the 48 hours hanging over her head. Lane froze, because she had never told anyone in this house those things, and when he saw the shock on her face, he said plainly that in this city, there were no secrets money couldn't buy, not even the records of a family court. Then he placed the offer amicable, one term at a time, neat as someone arranging chess pieces. He would give her a legal address, an apartment registered under a clean company, whose link to him no one could trace, enough for the court to regard it as stable housing. He would sign a real employment contract with her, with a transparent payroll, the title of household manager for this mansion, and a number on paper large enough that no judge could still doubt her financial ability. He would arrange health insurance for Whitney, the kind of insurance so good the little girl would never again have to wait in a hospital hallway because one paper was missing. Everything the system had told her she didn't deserve to have, he would hand to her in a single afternoon. Lane stood there, her heart pounding, and asked the question anyone in her position would have asked, what he wanted in return from a cleaning woman who had nothing in her hands. Killiorn didn't answer at once. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and for the first time his eyes no longer looked at her as a problem that needed handling, but as a man weighing an important move. He said that in this house, inside his organization, someone was betraying him. He didn't know who yet, but he knew for certain that person existed, because deals that should have been sealed tight had begun leaking out, and figures known only to a few had reached the ears of people who should never have known them. And his problem, he said, was that he couldn't trust anyone among the people surrounding him, because any one of them might be the traitor, Every face he saw each day might be smiling at him with one half and selling him out with the other. That was why he needed a pair of eyes and ears that didn't belong to his world. He looked at Lane and said she was the perfect outsider. She owed no one in the organization any favor, feared none of them, had no history, no alliance, no reason to cover for anyone under this roof. Someone like her, living right in the heart of the mansion under the cover of a housekeeper, would hear things his own men would never say in front of him, would see things people only did when they thought the person mopping the floor beside them was invisible. Her very invisibility, the thing she had spent her life seeing as a humiliation, was exactly what made her valuable to him. He said bluntly that he trusted her more than anyone he had paid over the past 10 years, not because he knew she was a good person, but because there wasn't a single thread tying her to the web he had begun to suspect. Lane listened to every word, and she understood that this man wasn't offering to help her. He was recruiting her into something more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined, trading what little peaceful life remained for her and her sister for a foothold among people willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand to stop her, telling her not to answer too quickly, because he wanted her to understand one thing first, that once she stepped in, there would be no clean way back, and that what he was offering her wasn't kindness, but a gamble in which both sides could lose everything. Lane took a step back, her spine nearly touching the walnut door, and she heard her own voice come out trembling but firm as she said she couldn't do it. She said she knew who he was, knew where the money for that spotless apartment came from, knew that the beautiful employment contract was only a coat of paint over something she never wanted to touch. She said she had spent 2 years proving to a court that she was a decent person, that she was clean enough, honest enough to raise her sister, and now, if she put her signature on what he was offering, she would turn herself with her own hand into the very thing they had always accused her of being, a woman living off dirty money and unworthy of her sister. She asked whether he had ever thought about what would happen if people found out, if the very network he suspected discovered that there was a maid listening in the dark. Then the first person to disappear would be her, and the 8-year-old child sleeping in a cramped apartment across the city would truly have no one left in the world. Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold on to her wildly beating heart. She said she would rather lose Whitney to a kind stranger's family than keep her by dragging her into a world where every door might be the last door. Killiorn sat still through that whole storm of fear, not interrupting, not frowning, only watching quietly like a man used to seeing other people collapse in front of him. When she stopped, breathless, he didn't answer her with promises or threats the way she had braced herself to hear. Instead, he stood, walked to the wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, and took out a small, old picture frame, its silver plating dulled by the years. He set it on the desk, turned it toward her, and Lane saw, in the black and white photograph, a thin boy of about 10 standing beside a younger little girl, both of them dressed in faded clothes, both of them smiling with the smile of children who did not yet know what life would take from them. He said very softly, so softly that Lane had to hold her breath to hear, that the little girl in the picture was named Nadia, and she was the reason he hadn't let his men deal with Lane from the very first moment downstairs. He told her that back then, the 2 siblings had lived in a wretched boarding house on the edge of the city, their mother gone, their father practically non-existent, and he, a boy not yet old enough to protect anyone, had done everything he could to keep his little sister alive through each winter. He said Nadia had weak lungs too, just like Whitney, that she too had nights when she wheezed for breath in the dark, and he had knocked on one door after another, one office after another, begging for a little help, a little medicine, a little mercy, but no one opened a door for a poor boy who had nothing to offer in return. He said that on the night Nadia died, he had sat holding her in that freezing room and sworn that he would never again let himself be in such a powerless position, would never again let poverty, weakness, or invisibility take anyone else from him, and everything he became afterward, all the power, all the fear he spread through the city, had grown from that small grave. Killiorn looked straight at Lane and said he wasn't telling her this to buy her pity, because he didn't believe in pity. He told her because he wanted her to understand something she was too frightened to see, that he wasn't saving her, He simply couldn't stand by and watch another child with weak lungs be taken from the only person willing to die for her. Not again. Not when he was the only one in this city with enough money and enough power to change that ending with a single signature. Lane stood frozen, the fear inside her still fully alive. But now it had been pierced by something she had not expected. The realization that the cold man before her had once knelt in a room as cold as hers, holding the most precious thing in his life, and helplessly watching it slip away. Killiorn gave her until the next morning to decide, and Lane left the mansion with the tarnished silver picture frame still haunting her mind, crossing the city on the last bus of the day, sitting close to the window and watching the lights of Atlanta slide past, without truly seeing any of them. By the time she reached the cramped third-floor apartment in an old building, it was almost 11 o'clock at night, and the kind neighbor who had watched Whitney for her, as usual, slipped quietly out after telling her the little girl had taken her medicine and slept well. Lane closed the door, leaned back against it for a long while in the dark, then tiptoed into the small room where Whitney lay curled beneath a thin blanket frayed at the edges. She sat down on the edge of the bed, looking at her sister's face in the weak light spilling in from the street lamp outside the window, and she listened to the child's breathing, that soft little sound that for the past 2 years had become the measure of every peace and every fear in Lane's life. Tonight that breathing was steady and easy, and Lane felt her throat tighten as she thought that some stranger, however kind, would never know how to tell Whitney's normal breathing apart from the sound that meant an asthma attack was coming, would never know that the girl was completely afraid of the dark and always needed a crack of light by the door, would never know that whenever she was frightened, she twisted her fingers into her own hair, would never know all the tiny things that made up a human being, the things only blood could know by heart. Whitney stirred slightly in her sleep, her eyes opening just a little, and when she realized her sister was sitting beside her, she smiled that drowsy smile and asked in a voice still caught in dreams whether Lane was going to stay with her, whether Lane was going to go away. Lane bent down, pressed her lips to her sister's forehead, and heard herself whisper that she would never go anywhere. Never, no matter what happened. Whitney asked again, still the same question she often asked when night came, and the fear of being abandoned crept in, whether the two of them would have to be separated, whether she had heard grown-ups talking about court, about how she might have to go live somewhere else, and Lane, looking into those clear eyes lifted toward her in search of safety, understood that every principle, every sense of self-respect, every moral boundary she had clung to all her life like the last thing she owned, all of it became weightless beside this small life. She had once thought that keeping herself clean was the noblest thing she could do, but now she realized that purity meant nothing if the price was losing the only person who still made her life worth living. She remembered Killiorn's words, that he couldn't stand by and watch another child with weak lungs be taken from the only person willing to die for her, and for the first time she understood that some choices did not lie between right and wrong, but between two kinds of pain and a real mother, even if she was only a sister standing in a mother's place, would always choose the pain that kept her child close. Lane sat there for a very long time after Whitney had fallen asleep again, her hand gently smoothing her sister's tangled hair, and in that darkness she silently made the decision she knew would change who she was forever. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she called the phone number Killiorn had left behind, and when that cold, low voice sounded on the other end of the line, she said only one sentence, that she agreed, with one condition, that no matter what happened, he had to promise Whitney would always be safe, always kept outside everything that belonged to his world. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then Killiorn answered in a voice that, for the first time, carried something almost like respect, saying that he promised, and that whatever people said about him, a promise of his had never been something he betrayed. Lane hung up, looked out the window where dawn was slowly brightening over the rooftops, and she knew the door she had just stepped through would never open backward again. But for the first time in many weeks, she felt something rising in her chest that was warm and frightening in equal measure, something very much like hope. 2 days later, a car quietly came to pick up the two sisters and the few cardboard boxes that held everything they owned in the world. And when the iron gate of the mansion closed behind them, Whitney pressed her face to the window, her eyes widening at the vast garden and the building so large that she had to tilt her head back just to take it all in. The first person to greet them on the stone steps was not Killiorn, but a woman of about 60, small in build but standing perfectly straight, her silver hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, and her eyes carrying a warmth that felt strangely out of place in a place so cold. She introduced herself as Maid Donnelly, the head housekeeper of the mansion, the woman who had watched over this house since before Killiorn moved in, and when she shook Lane's hand, she held it longer than an ordinary handshake, looking at her as if she had known about her long before this moment. It was while she led the two sisters through the long stone-floored hallways that Maeve quietly revealed something Lane had never imagined, that the cleaning job at the Ashworth mansion, the place where fate had pushed Lane into Killiorn's path, had not been a coincidence at all. She said she often agreed to help familiar families find reliable workers, and a few months earlier, through an introduction at the church where she attended service every Sunday, she had heard about a young girl, working herself to exhaustion, through 3 shifts a day just to keep her little sister, a girl whom everyone who had ever hired her praised for being so honest that she returned even loose coins found beneath a sofa cushion. Maeve said it was she who had recommended Lane for the job at the Ashworth house, simply because she believed a decent person deserved decent work, and she had never imagined that the small thread she had unknowingly spun would lead that girl all the way to the threshold of the most powerful man in the city. Lane fell silent at the truth, feeling as though her life had somehow been arranged by invisible hands she had never known existed, but in Maeve's kind eyes, she found no trace of calculation, only a quiet goodness that had been watching over her longer than she had realized. Maeve took the two sisters up to a room in the east wing of the mansion, spacious and warm, with windows overlooking the garden, and when Whitney saw the soft bed and the gentle sliver of light from the night lamp that somehow had already been placed in the corner of the room, she let out a small cry of delight and turned to throw her arms around her sister. But what caught Lane's attention most on that first afternoon was not the room, but Whitney's impossible-to-hide curiosity about the master of the house. The little girl kept asking about the tall man dressed in black whom she had briefly seen standing at the top of the stairs when they first came in, asking why he didn't smile, why everyone in the house spoke softly whenever he passed by, why he lived alone in such a huge house with no one to keep him company. Lane tried to change the subject, saying that he was only the man letting them stay there, and that Whitney shouldn't bother him. But Whitney, with the strange intuition of children, didn't see the things adults tried to hide, only tilted her head in thought and said that she thought he was sad, very sad. The same way Lane had been sad when their parents had just died. That innocent remark made Lane stop still, because it touched exactly the thing she had faintly sensed in the study on the second floor, and she looked at her sister for a long time, wondering what those small eyes had already managed to see that grown people needed so long before daring to admit. That night, when the whole mansion had sunk into silence, Lane stood by the window looking down into the dark garden, and she saw the shadow of a man standing alone among the perfectly trimmed rows of trees, motionless for a long time beneath the moonlight, so lonely that even from far away she could feel it, and she suddenly realized that perhaps her 8-year-old girl had been right. On the day of the final hearing, Lane walked into the Fulton County Family Court with a thick file of documents that only a few weeks earlier she would never have dared dream of having. And this time, she was no longer the trembling woman standing before the court with 2 empty hands. The lawyer Killiorn had hired for her, a sharp woman dressed with immaculate care, presented each piece of evidence to the judge one by one: the lease for a respectable apartment held under a legal name, the transparent payroll record with the title of household manager and a stable income, the certificate of comprehensive health insurance for Whitney, including medication and long-term asthma treatment, all of it clean, all of it valid, all of it correct down to every period and comma the law required. The judge turned through each page, from time to time lifting his eyes to look at Lane over his glasses. And Lane sat there with both hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole room could hear it, while Whitney sat quietly on the bench behind her, her small legs swinging without touching the floor. When the judge finally struck the gavel, and declared that the court found the guardian had fully proven sufficient conditions of housing, finances, and medical care to continue raising the child. Lane couldn't hold herself together any longer. She burst into tears right there, her shoulders shaking, and when she turned to look at her sister, Whitney had already rushed forward and thrown her arms around her, burying her face in Lane's neck, and the two sisters simply held each other and cried in the middle of the courtroom while the people around them looked on in softened silence. If at this point you also feel your chest grow warm before the moment a sister wins back her little sister, please pause for 1 second and press the like button. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that good things still happen in this world, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking with these two sisters on the road ahead, where many storms still wait. But right in the middle of that overflowing joy, there was a figure standing silently at the back of the room, and it took Lane a while to recognize him. It was Preston Hale, the attorney representing the Department of Child Protective Services. A gray-haired man of about 50, with a face that always held a calmness difficult to read, the man who had followed her case closely for 2 years and had more than once asked questions that left her unable to sleep. He came closer when all the procedures were finished and congratulated her in a properly courteous voice. But then he lingered longer than necessary, and while Whitney was busy playing with the badge on the court clerk's jacket, he lowered his voice and asked Lane a question she would remember for a long time afterward, saying that he was curious to know who her new employer was, the one generous enough to give her such a good job, because in his many years of experience, very few employers arranged such a generous health insurance package for a worker after only a few weeks of probation. He smiled as he said it, a polite and harmless smile, but his eyes did not smile with it. They stayed fixed on Lane's face with a cold attention she had seen before in people following a trace. Lane tried to keep her voice calm, answering that she had simply been lucky enough to find decent work, and Preston Hale nodded slowly, saying yes. Luck was indeed a strange thing. Then he said goodbye and left, leaving Lane standing there with a vague unease slipping into the middle of her happiness. She told herself that perhaps she was imagining too much, that the man was only doing his job as he always had, but when he disappeared beyond the courtroom door, Lane couldn't shake the feeling that the look in his eyes had not been idle curiosity, but the beginning of something she could not yet name, a fine thread just pulled taut in the dark, and she did not yet know how tightly it would coil around her. She tightened her hand around Whitney's, led her out of the courthouse under the noon sunlight, and forced herself to think only of today's victory, of the fact that tonight the little girl would once again sleep in the room, with the gentle strip of light by the door, safe, beside her sister, at least for now. About 3 weeks after the two sisters moved into the mansion, on a late-season night when the air had turned unusually cold, Lane startled awake at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, because of a sound that the motherly instinct inside her had learned to recognize even in the deepest sleep, the sound of Whitney struggling to breathe from the bed beside hers. She sprang up, ran to her sister's side, and with just one look she knew this wasn't the usual shortness of breath that could be soothed with the familiar inhaler, because the little girl was fighting for every breath, her thin shoulders rising and falling far too quickly, her small face going pale in the soft nightlight. Lane tried to stay calm, doing everything she had been taught to do, but when several minutes passed and her sister's breathing still did not ease, that familiar, ice-cold fear surged back into her chest, the fear of all those nights when she had once carried Whitney alone to the emergency room and sat for hours in the hallway because she didn't have enough money. She swept Whitney up into her arms and rushed into the dark hallway, and at that exact moment, as if the shadows of this house had their own eyes and ears, a door flew open and Killiorn appeared at the top of the stairs, still dressed in dark clothes as if he hadn't gone to bed at all. He looked at the child in Lane's arms for only 1 second, and he didn't ask a single question, didn't hesitate for even a moment. He only said, "Follow me," then strode down the stairs so quickly that Lane had to run to keep up. He didn't call a driver, didn't wait for anyone. He opened the door of the car already parked in front of the steps himself, took the wheel, and while Lane sat in the back seat holding Whitney tightly, whispering words of reassurance into her ear, the man the whole city feared drove through the empty streets of Atlanta at midnight, with cold concentration, one hand on the steering wheel, the other pressing his phone as he called the best private hospital in the city directly, ordering in a voice that allowed no refusal that a team had better be waiting at the door when his car arrived. When the car slid up to the emergency entrance, there were indeed people waiting with a stretcher, and Whitney was taken inside within seconds. The medical team quickly did what needed to be done. The door closed, and Lane was left standing frozen in the hallway with both hands still trembling. She suddenly realized that Killiorn had not left as she had expected, had not returned to his world after fulfilling the part the contract required of him, but was still standing there, silently, a few steps away from her, both hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes fixed on the emergency room door with an expression Lane had never seen on his face before. It was not cruelty, not power, but a quiet tension, almost fear, the fear of a man who had once stood in a cold hallway just like this one long ago, and walked away with empty hands. They waited beside each other in silence for nearly 1 hour, neither of them saying anything, but that silence was no longer the silence between an employer and a servant. It was the silence of two people holding their breath for one small life. When the door finally opened and the doctor stepped out with a reassuring smile, saying the girl had passed the danger, was breathing normally again, and only needed to stay until morning for observation, Lane sank onto the nearest chair, both hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with an overwhelming relief that broke through her all at once. And when she looked up through her tears, she caught a moment she would never forget, the sight of Killiorn Drayton turning his face away very quickly, but not quickly enough for her to miss, the way those hard shoulders slackened slightly, and the way his hand quietly rose to rub at his eyes, the man people said had never once blinked while watching others beg, unable that night to hide something he himself had, perhaps forgotten he still had. After that night at the hospital, something in the way Lane looked at this man changed, and she began to notice him in a way she had never allowed herself to before, with the eyes of someone trying to understand instead of someone who only knew how to be afraid. She realized that Killiorn almost never slept. Her role as household manager in the mansion made her one of the earliest to rise, sometimes before the sky had even begun to lighten, and almost every night, whether it was 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, she would see the pale yellow strip of light spilling from beneath the door of his study on the 2nd floor. On nights when she couldn't sleep because she was worried about Whitney, she would go down to the kitchen to make a cup of warm milk, and when she passed through the long stone-floored hallway, she would again catch sight of him standing alone by the tall window in the vast living room, with no lights on, only moonlight pouring in and casting his shadow across the floor, motionless for hours like a statue, one hand holding a glass of liquor she had never once seen him finish. She noticed the way he ate alone at the head of a dining table long enough to seat 20 people, the way an entire staff of servants and guards surrounded him all day, yet not a single one of them dared sit beside him, not a single one called his name in a familiar voice, not one burst of laughter sounded when he entered a room. She realized that this man, the most powerful man in the city, the man who owned a house large enough to hold an entire crowded family, lived more alone than she ever had in her cramped apartment, because at least she had Whitney, at least she had a small hand reaching for hers in the night, while he had nothing but expensive walls and the fearful respect of people whose loyalty came only from his wallet. One early morning, as Lane carried a tray of coffee past the study, she accidentally saw through the partly open door the image of him sitting with his head lowered on the desk, amid piles of documents, fallen asleep in the posture of a man so exhausted he had collapsed right where he worked, and on the corner of the desk, tilted at an angle where his eyes could find it whenever he looked up, was the tarnished silver frame she had seen before, the photograph of the thin boy and the little sister with weak lungs. She stood silently at the threshold for a long while, and a strange feeling rose in her chest, not fear, and not yet something she dared give a name to, but a deep compassion mixed with something warm and bewildering, the feeling one has when suddenly seeing the wound of someone the whole world believes can't be hurt. She quietly set the still hot cup of coffee on the desk beside him, gently pulled the thin blanket draped over the sofa across his shoulders, then withdrew without a sound, and all that day she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had slept there with his head down, about the picture frame angled within his sight. She began to understand that all his coldness, All the terror he spread was only a thick layer of ice wrapped around something that had been frozen solid long ago, and that beneath that ice there was still a person who had once known how to love so deeply that losing that love had been enough to ruin the rest of his life. Lane said nothing to him about the things she had observed, and he didn't know she had seen him in those most unguarded moments. But from those days on, whenever she passed him in the hallway, she no longer lowered her face and hurried by. Instead, she lightly met his eyes for a moment, long enough for something silent and fragile to begin weaving itself between two people who had once stood at opposite ends of life, something both of them could feel, but neither yet dared speak aloud. But Lane did not forget that she had been brought into this house, not to sympathize with its master, but to be his eyes and ears inside a network he could no longer trust. And once she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life in the mansion, she began quietly doing the work she had agreed to do. In the role of a nearly invisible household manager, she was everywhere without anyone paying attention, pouring coffee during closed meetings, cleaning the hallway outside doors left slightly ajar, passing by powerful men whispering to one another in the corner of the garden. And it was that very invisibility that allowed her to hear and see things Killiorn would never witness directly. The person who caught her attention most was Thorne Gallagher, Killiorn's right-hand man, a man of about 45 with a smile always resting on his lips but never reaching his eyes, the one everyone in the house respected and feared second only to the master. Lane noticed that something was wrong in the way Thorne behaved. Whenever Killiorn was absent, the way his voice changed, the way he lingered longer than necessary in his employer's study when he thought no one was watching, the way he quietly photographed pages of documents with his phone and then quickly placed them back exactly where they had been. Once, hidden behind a stone column in the hallway, she accidentally heard Thorne lowering his voice on the phone with someone about a deal she knew for certain only Killiorn's most trusted people were allowed to know. And his voice carried a tone she could not mistake, the tone of a man calculating the day when he would no longer stand beneath another man's command. Lane's heart pounded when she realized she might have just touched the very traitor Killiorn was searching for, and the feeling of real danger became terrifyingly concrete for the first time. Because if a man like Thorne discovered she was watching him, then Killiorn's warning about there being no clean way back would become true in the cruelest way. That night, she went to Maeve in the empty kitchen, needing someone to share the weight pressing on her chest. And it was during that quiet conversation beside a pot of hot tea that the old housekeeper told her something that left her speechless. Maeve admitted that her recommendation of Lane for the job at the Ashworth house had not been entirely accidental, as she had once allowed Lane to believe that for a long time she had felt this house, and the lonely man living inside it, slowly rotting from within because of all the lies and greed surrounding him, and that she had been silently praying for someone honest, someone whose heart was still whole, to step inside and awaken whatever goodness she believed still remained in Killiorn, the goodness she had glimpsed in the early days before that young master had turned into the cold man he was now. Maeve held Lane's hand and said perhaps harsh fate had pushed her here not only to save Whitney, but also for a larger reason she had not yet seen. Lane returned to her room that night with her emotions tangled, and for the first time since signing the agreement, she faced directly the question she had been trying to avoid for so long: were the money feeding her sister, buying the little girl's medicine, and paying for the warm room where she now slept safely truly came from, and how many other people's pain had been traded for it? She looked down at her hands in the darkness, the hands she had once been proud of, because they had never taken a single dollar that did not belong to her, and she felt a deep torment tearing through her, because she was no longer the clean woman standing before the court. She had set one foot into the gray area, and she understood that in order to keep her sister safe, she would have to live with that stain every day, unless she found a way to do something better from the very dangerous place where she now stood. The question of doing something better from where she stood kept haunting Lane, and she did not have to wait long for her first chance, because a few days later she accidentally heard the name Corbin Ashworth come up again in Killiorn's conversations, the owner of the mansion where fate had pushed her into meeting him, the man who still owed him a large sum, and whose debt was coming due in a way Lane did not want to imagine. This time, Instead of silently observing and remembering like an invisible pair of ears, Lane did something she never would have dared on the first day she entered this house. She deliberately knocked on the door of Killiorn's study late one evening and stepped inside, not as a servant waiting for orders, but as one human being who wanted to speak to another. Killiorn looked up from the pile of documents, his brows narrowing slightly at her suddenness, but he did not send her away, and Lane drew a deep breath before saying plainly that she knew about Corbin Ashworth. Knew that the man had a little daughter only around Whitney's age, and she was asking him not to do the thing she feared he was about to do. Killiorn leaned back in his chair, his eyes turning cold, and he reminded her that this was business, that Corbin had borrowed money from him and had been given enough time to repay it, that if he allowed a debtor to walk away simply because the man had a small child, then tomorrow the whole city would come to his door, carrying their children as excuses not to pay what they owed, and that softness in his world was not kindness, but a form of suicide. But Lane did not retreat the way she had on that night a few weeks earlier, trembling with her back against the walnut door. This time, she stepped closer to his desk, placed both hands on the wood, and said in a steady voice that she had not come to ask him to be weak. She had come to ask him a question that perhaps no one had ever dared ask him: what all the money he had, all the power that made the entire city bow its head, had truly bought him in the end besides long sleepless nights, and a huge house without a single burst of laughter. She said she had seen him, not the man people whispered about, but the man standing alone by the window at midnight, the man fallen asleep with his head on the desk, beside the photograph of a little sister he had lost. And she asked him whether money had ever bought back even one peaceful night for his soul. She said that the way he treated Corbin today was exactly the way the world had once treated him, and Nadia long ago, when he had knocked on doors begging for a little mercy, and no one had opened them. That if he pushed Corbin's little daughter into the same helplessness he had once tasted, then he was no different from the people who had turned their backs on him that year. He was only continuing the cold circle that had destroyed him. Lane said she believed people could choose to break that circle, that a man powerful enough to destroy also had enough power to save, and that the difference between those two things was what truly defined who he was, not the money in his vault or the fear printed on other people's faces. The room sank into silence for a long time after those words, and Lane saw something move behind his eyes that never seemed to blink, a silent struggle between the man he had become and the boy he had once been. Killiorn did not answer her right away. He only turned his face toward the dark window, his jaw clenched tight, and after a long while he said quietly, almost to himself, that she did not understand how this world worked, but his voice lacked its usual cold certainty. A few days later, Lane heard that Corbin Ashworth's debt had been extended indefinitely without any consequences attached, and though Killiorn would never admit it was because of what she had said, she understood that the first brick in the wall of ice around his heart had cracked, ever so slightly, and that she had reached something money and violence had never managed to touch in all those years. But while one wall of ice was quietly beginning to crack, in another hidden corner of the house, another pair of eyes was watching too, and Thorne Gallagher was not a man easily fooled. He had long since noticed the way the new housekeeper came and went near the master's study more often than any ordinary servant should. The way she always seemed to appear just when important conversations were taking place. The way Killiorn, a man who had never allowed anyone close, strangely allowed this woman to enter and leave his private world. As someone who had spent his whole life reading people and smelling betrayal before it showed itself, Thorne quickly put the pieces together, and one afternoon, when he happened to catch Lane lingering far too long outside a half-open door where he had just finished a sensitive call, he understood the truth, that this girl was not simply a servant. She was the pair of eyes Killiorn had planted among them. That discovery should have frightened Thorne, but instead a slow and cold smile spread across his lips, because he had just realized something even more valuable than the fact that he had been exposed, that the most powerful man in Atlanta, the man whose weakness he had failed to find for so many years, finally had a crack, and that crack had the shape of a woman and an 8-year-old child. If you are holding your breath as you follow the trap, slowly tightening around Lane and Whitney, please press the like button to give this story more strength. Share it with a friend who loves stories filled with drama and emotion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will test the hearts of every character in a way no one could have expected. Thorn understood that attacking Killiorn directly was a battle he could not win, but even the strongest lion could be brought down if a man knew how to aim at the one thing that made it hesitate. And for the first time after so many years of serving under a man who had nothing to lose, Thorn had found the thing Killiorn feared losing. That night, he drove out of the city to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Atlanta, where he met a man representing a rival organization that had long coveted the territory Killiorn controlled, men who had tried many times to bring him down, but had always failed, because no one on the inside had dared betray him. Thorn sat across from that man and placed his offer on the table, saying he would open the door from within, would give them the secrets, the schedules, the weaknesses that only the closest man could know, and in return, he wanted the top position when the old empire collapsed and Killiorn was gone. When the other man asked how he could be certain of bringing down someone so cautious and ruthless, Thorn only smiled and said every fortress had a gate, and Killiorn Drayton's gate had just revealed itself, in the shape of something that man had been foolish enough to begin caring about again. He said that all they needed to do was strike at the woman and the child, and the lion would step out of his den on his own, losing all the cold calculation that had made him unbeatable, and then ending him would only be a matter of time. That handshake in the darkness of the warehouse decided that the brief, peaceful days inside the mansion were about to end, and while Lane was slowly warming a frozen heart without even knowing it, a colder plot than anything she had ever imagined had begun to move, aimed straight at the most precious thing she had, unaware of the storm forming out there. The following days in the mansion passed in a gentle warmth that neither Lane nor Killiorn had ever truly had, and one night, when the whole house had fallen asleep, the two of them happened to be in the library at the same time, he with his familiar glass of liquor that never seemed to empty, she with a cup of hot tea, and this time, instead of quietly withdrawing, Lane sat down in the chair across from him. In the warm yellow light, the defenses between them slowly grew thinner, and Killiorn, perhaps because of her quiet, unjudging presence, began to speak more about Nadia, about the games the two siblings had invented to forget their hunger, about the sound of the little girl's laughter that he could still hear in his rare dreams, about the promise he had failed to keep, the promise that he would give her a real home. He said that for all these years he had believed that if he became rich enough, powerful enough, frightening enough, then that pain would fade, but it turned out he had only built a fortress around a wound that never healed. In turn, Lane told him about the rainy night 2 winters earlier, about the fateful phone call, saying that her parents' car had been in an accident on the highway, about the moment her whole world collapsed and she, only 25 years old then, suddenly became everything that was left for a 6-year-old girl, sleeping at home without knowing a thing. She told him about the nights she cried silently in the bathroom, so Whitney wouldn't hear, about the constant fear that she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough to replace both a father and a mother, and as she spoke, Killiorn listened with an attentiveness no one had ever given her before. And in that moment their 2 wounds reflected each other. 2 people who had lost everything, and had been forced to responsibility for a small life sitting across from one another, close enough that both of them could feel something dangerous and sweet rising between them, something neither of them yet dared give a name. It was then that a small voice sounded from the doorway, and both of them startled and turned to see Whitney standing there in her pajamas, hugging her old stuffed bear, her eyes still heavy with sleep, because she had just woken up and come looking for her sister. The little girl slowly walked in, climbed onto Lane's lap, then looked at Killiorn with her clear eyes, and said something that made the whole room fall silent, that she knew he wasn't exactly a good man, because she had heard the other men say he was very scary, but she didn't believe them. Killiorn froze, and Whitney, with the honesty only children have, went on to say that bad people don't stay awake all night worrying about others. Bad people don't drive someone to the hospital themselves and stand waiting outside the door all evening. Bad people aren't sad the way he was sad. Then the little girl yawned, nestled her head against her sister's shoulder, and whispered before drifting off that she thought he just needed someone so he wouldn't have to be sad alone anymore. Lane held her sister tightly, her throat closing. And when she looked up at Killiorn, she saw the man the whole city feared sitting motionless, his eyes shining in the yellow light, brought down completely not by an enemy force or the barrel of a gun, but by a few truthful words from an 8-year-old child who had looked through every layer of ice and seen the lonely human being hidden beneath. That tender moment had barely had time to settle before the first blow came down, and it came from a direction Lane had never guarded against, not from the underworld with its gun barrels and shadows, but from the very system she had always believed was upright. One morning, she received an official letter from the Department of Child Protective Services, informing her that her guardianship file had been reopened for additional evaluation, and the name signed beneath the letter was none other than Preston Hale. Lane's heart sank as she read the reason given. This time, not a single word mentioned finances or housing, because those things were clean and legally untouchable, but instead there was a concern that sounded so reasonable it was chilling, that the agency had received information indicating that the guardian and the child were currently living under the same roof with an individual who had a history and serious suspicions connected to unlawful activity, and that such an environment might not guarantee safety for a child's development. The letter required her to provide an explanation and be ready for a new investigation, and if she couldn't prove Whitney was living in a safe environment, the guardianship she had just fought back with so many tears could once again be considered for removal. Lane stood frozen in the mansion hallway with the letter trembling in her hand, and she understood at once the brutality of this move, because the attack was not aimed at something she could fix, but straight at the place where she stood, at the very place that had saved her and Whitney, turning it from a shelter into evidence against her. The more she thought, the more clearly she saw the hand arranging everything behind it, because it was no coincidence that Preston Hale, the man who had asked her that vague question about her new employer in court that day, the man who had looked at her with the eyes of someone following a trail, was the one who had signed this letter. She remembered his polite smile that had not reached his eyes, and she suddenly understood that his curiosity that day had never been harmless. It had been the first thread of a net that was now beginning to tighten. What Lane couldn't know then was that Preston Hale, the man she had once believed to be a cold but upright symbol of justice, was no longer acting for justice at all, because only a few days earlier, in a discreet meeting, Thorne Gallagher had come to him with a thick envelope and honeyed words, striking precisely at the debts and secrets that this man so devoted to his profession had hidden for years. Thorne didn't need Hale to do anything violent. He only needed him to use his lawful authority to tear the child away, because he understood that no weapon could make Killiorn lose direction, more than seeing the woman he had begun to care about collapse before a force that even his money and guns could not directly fight. That night, when Lane brought the letter to Killiorn, his face darkened in a way she had never seen before, not with explosive anger, but with a deadly coldness, because he recognized at once that this was not an ordinary administrative procedure, but a calculated move aimed at the very weakness he had been foolish enough to reveal, and for the first time in a very long time, the man who had always controlled every piece on the board felt something he thought he had forgotten. The fear of losing something truly important. The new legal blow cast the entire mansion into an atmosphere of tension, and while Killiorn quietly mobilized lawyers and connections to trace whoever stood behind the letter, Thorne, understanding that this chaos was the perfect smokescreen, decided to strike the second blow at the very moment when everyone's attention was fixed on the court. On that fateful afternoon, Maeve took Whitney out to the back garden as usual, so the little girl could breathe some fresh air after days spent indoors, and in only the brief moment when she turned back inside to fetch the child a warmer coat because the wind had grown chilly, everything happened. When Maeve came back out, the garden was empty. The side gate in the far corner that was always kept locked had been left slightly open, and Whitney was gone. The old housekeeper's terrified cry rang through the mansion, sending Lane, who had been sitting with the lawyer in the library, racing out like an arrow, and when she reached the garden and saw the silent, empty yard where her sister should have been playing, the whole world seemed to collapse beneath her feet. She called Whitney's name, ran all over the garden, tore through every bush and every hidden corner, but only the cold wind answered her, And when that terrible truth sank into her mind, her legs gave way on the grass, her trembling hands covering her face. Because the greatest fear of her life, the fear she had traded even her own innocence to prevent, had now become real in the cruelest possible way. Killiorn appeared only a few minutes later, and when he saw the empty garden and lane crumpled on the ground, his face changed in a way that made even the most hardened guards step back, because this was no longer the familiar cold calculation, but an icy fury so chilling it made the blood run cold. He immediately ordered the entire area locked down, mobilizing every person, every resource, every camera within a radius of several miles. But even as he set his enormous machine of power in motion, deep inside he already knew the answer. Already knew there was only one man who understood the schedule of this house, down to the minute, knew exactly when the garden would be unguarded, knew which side gate drew the least attention, a man too close to be suspected. Less than 1 hour later, what he had expected was confirmed when his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. No threat, no voice, only a photograph showing Whitney sitting safely in a strange room with her stuffed bear in her hands, and beneath it a short, cold line saying the girl was fine and would stay fine as long as Killiorn behaved, along with the promise that someone would make contact to discuss the terms of exchange. Lane read the message over his shoulder and broke down, caught between tearing grief and a fragile thread of comfort that at least her sister was safe, still holding her familiar stuffed bear, and Killiorn turned to her, placed both hands on her shoulders to keep her standing, then said in a voice low and solid as stone that he promised her, with everything he had, he would bring Whitney back, that the man who had dared touch the child had made the final and greatest mistake of his life. In that moment, amid the horror, Lane realized that the man before her was no longer acting like a crime lord protecting his property or his pride, but like a human being fighting for someone he loved, and she understood that the real war had only just begun. The contact Thorne had promised came the following evening, and when Killiorn finally spoke to the man behind it all, every suspicion he had was confirmed, because the cold, self-satisfied voice on the other end of the line belonged to the man he had trusted for so many years. Thorne did not circle around the matter. He laid his price directly on the table, saying that for the child to be returned safely, Killiorn had to hand over control of the entire empire he had spent his life building, had to withdraw from every territory, every business arrangement, had to disappear and let him and the people behind him take over everything. It was a trade any crime lord would have considered madness, giving up all power, all wealth, everything that made him untouchable, just to exchange it for a child who was not even his own blood. And Thorne was certain he had driven Killiorn into a corner with no way out, because he believed that a cold, calculating man like his former boss would never choose one small life over an entire kingdom. But Thorne had miscalculated one thing. He was still looking at Killiorn through the eyes of the old days, not knowing that the man had changed, that a few truthful words from an 8-year-old child, and the quiet presence of a decent woman, had melted the ice that years of money and violence had never been able to touch. Killiorn hung up, turned to Lane, and without a second of hesitation said he would accept that this whole empire, everything he had, was not worth a single strand of Whitney's hair, that he had once watched a child slip from his hands because he had been powerless, and this time, when he held all the power in the world, he wouldn't repeat that mistake even if it cost him everything. Those words left Lane silent, because she understood exactly the price this man was willing to pay, and in that moment she realized she couldn't simply stand still and let him sacrifice his entire life. She had spent her life being a woman who only endured fate, a victim pushed around by circumstance, but tonight something inside her rose up, and she made a decision of her own. She secretly contacted the number that had sent the message, and when Thorne heard her voice instead of Killiorn's, he was surprised. But Lane quickly said something that forced him to listen, that all this time, she had been the person Killiorn placed inside the house to watch him, that she had seen and heard enough of his secrets, his calls, his hidden dealings with her own eyes and ears to destroy him, even if his plan to seize power succeeded. She said she knew what he had done, knew the people he had joined hands with, and that such a mass of information in the hands of someone with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than Killiorn himself. But she was willing to make a trade, willing to hand over herself and everything she knew in exchange for Whitney being released safely. Thorne was silent for a long time on the other end of the line, and Lane knew he was weighing it, because to a man about to take the throne like him, eliminating the only witness who could expose him, while also holding a card strong enough to control, Killiorn was too great a bargain to refuse. When he finally agreed to the exchange, Lane hung up with trembling hands but steady eyes, then turned away and hid her plan from Killiorn, because she knew that if he found out, he would never let her walk into the wolf's mouth alone. But Lane had underestimated one thing, that a man who had once lost everything because of helplessness would never take his eyes off what he had sworn to protect. And Killiorn, who was alert to every small movement inside his own house, had noticed the difference in her eyes, that look of resolve mixed with resignation belonging to someone who had just decided to sacrifice herself. He quietly had someone follow her closely, and when Lane secretly left the mansion at dawn to go to the meeting place Thorne had chosen, an old warehouse by the river on the edge of the city, Killiorn knew, and he and his most loyal men followed silently through the dark. Lane walked into that cold warehouse alone, her heart pounding, and there she saw Thorne waiting with his familiar self-satisfied smile and several of his men. But more important than anything, she saw Whitney sitting on a chair in the far corner, clutching her stuffed bear, exhausted but safe, and the moment the sisters' eyes met, the little girl burst into tears and called out to her. Thorne signaled for Lane to come closer to complete the exchange, but he had no intention of keeping his word, because to a man like him, letting both the witness and the child leave alive was a risk he would never accept. And at the very moment he revealed that intention, the warehouse door burst open and Killiorn and his men stormed in. Chaos erupted in an instant, shouts, running footsteps, shadows lunging at one another in the dim light, and amid that struggle, Lane only had time to rush toward Whitney, wrap her arms around her, and use her own body to shield the little girl from every danger. Thorne, realizing that his plan was collapsing, and that everything he had plotted for years was dissolving into smoke, turned toward the two sisters in desperation, and at the most dangerous instant, Killiorn did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He lunged forward, pushed Lane and Whitney out of danger, and placed his own body between Thorne and the people he was determined to protect. A sound rang out, and Killiorn staggered, one side of his shirt spreading red, but even after being struck, he still managed to overpower Thorne, and his men quickly brought the whole warehouse under control, pinning the remaining men to the floor. Killiorn sank to his knees, and Lane let Whitney go into the arms of someone trustworthy, then rushed to his side, her trembling hands cradling the paling face of the man who had just risked everything for her and her sister. She called his name through tears, pressed hard against the wound, begged him to hold on, and Killiorn, though his breathing was already weak, still tried to form a faint smile when he saw Whitney safe in the arms of one of his men. He lifted a shaking hand to touch Lane's cheek, and in a broken whisper, he said that years ago he hadn't been able to save Nadia, had been forced to watch his little sister leave him without being able to do anything. But this time, he said, this time he had saved her sister, and that alone was enough to make his whole sinful life worth something. Lane broke down sobbing, shaking her head, saying that he wasn't allowed to speak as though this were goodbye, that he had to live, had to stay, that Whitney needed him and so did she, and in that moment, in the cold warehouse where death was hovering nearby, she admitted aloud for the first time what her heart had known for a long while, that she couldn't lose him. Killiorn looked at her, his eyes softening through the pain, and he whispered that hearing her say, that left him with nothing to regret. Before his eyes closed and the siren of the ambulance his men had called began to echo from far away, the ambulance siren drew closer and closer. But inside that cold warehouse, another struggle was unfolding, not with fists, but with things far deeper. Killiorn was helped to his feet by his loyal men, the wound temporarily pressed tight, and though his face was pale from blood loss, his eyes still stopped on Thorne Gallagher, who was being pinned to the floor, the traitor who had pushed them all into this tragedy. One of Killiorn's men bent down, waiting for an order, and everyone understood that all it would take was a nod from the boss, and Thorne would vanish from this world forever, exactly the way the underworld had operated for so many years, according to the very law Killiorn himself had lived by and enforced his whole life. In that moment, rage and years of instinct for revenge rose in his eyes, his hand tightened, and Lane saw the man she loved standing on the narrow edge between the person he had once been and the person he could still become. She knelt beside him, took the hand that was trembling from anger and pain, and spoke to him with all the pleading in her heart, telling him no, that if he gave that order, he would forever return to the man who had imprisoned him in loneliness for all these years, that the circle of blood paid for with blood would never stop and would drag him back to the very darkness he had only just begun to escape. She told him Whitney was watching, that the little girl had once believed he wasn't a bad man, and she begged him not to prove her wrong, not to let the final moment of this battle redefine all the good he had just done when he used his own body to shield her and her sister. If your heart is tightening right now as you watch a person choose between darkness and light, please press the like button. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that people can always choose to become better, and subscribe to the channel so we can reach the ending of this journey together. Killiorn looked at Lane for a long time, then looked over at Whitney, who was pressed into the arms of one of his guards, her childlike eyes bewildered and still shining with trust, and something inside him finally let go. The anger in his eyes faded, giving way to a deep exhaustion and a strange peace. He gave a slight shake of his head, signaling for his men to step back, then said in a weak but firm voice to let him live, and let the law deal with him. It was Lane who took out her phone and called emergency services, clearly reporting the location and the situation, and when the 911 operator asked, she calmly reported a child abduction suspect was being held at the scene, waiting for the authorities to arrive. It was an act Killiorn had never once done in all his life in the underworld, handing an enemy over to the legal system instead of dealing with him himself, and when he heard her calling the police, he did not stop her. He only gently tightened his hand around hers in silent agreement, as if he were giving her permission to guide him out of the darkness, where he would never have found the way alone. When the red and blue lights of the ambulance and police cars finally poured in and lit up the warehouse, Thorne was led away in the cold clink of metal, while Killiorn was placed on a stretcher, his hand still holding Lane's, and as the paramedics hurried to do their work, Whitney ran over and took his other hand. The man who had once made the whole city tremble was carried away between the two people who had taught him that true strength did not lie in the power to destroy, but in the courage to choose mercy. Killiorn survived that long night, though he had to go through surgery and many weeks in the hospital, and during the days, he lay in the sickbed with Lane almost never leaving his side and Whitney bringing clumsy coloring pages to cover the walls of his hospital room. Something inside him changed forever. He had more time to think than he had had in his whole life put together, and one afternoon, when pale sunlight fell through the hospital window, he held Lane's hand and for the first time said aloud, something he had never admitted to anyone, that everything he had built over all those years, the entire empire that had made the city tremble, had never truly been only about money or power, but from the very beginning had been a long, unending revenge against the world that had turned its back and let Nadia die, a way for him to never again be weak and helpless. But now, he said, he understood that he had only been letting an old pain control him, only building new suffering on top of the suffering from long ago, and that the only way to truly honor his sister was not to spread fear but to end it. Once he recovered, Killiorn began doing something no one in the underworld believed a boss could do. He began dismantling the very empire he had shed blood to build, cutting off unlawful dealings, moving his enormous assets onto transparent and legal paths, turning money, once stained by darkness, into something that could stand in the light. With that fortune made clean in the noblest sense of the word, he founded a charitable organization, and gave it the name that made both him and Lane weep when they wrote it on the paperwork, the Nadia and Whitney Foundation. An organization devoted entirely to helping orphaned children, poor families with young children who were ill, people who were knocking on doors, asking for a little help, just as he and Nadia had once knocked years ago, only to have no one open. Every child saved by that foundation was a brick he placed on the small grave in his past, a late but sincere apology to the little sister he hadn't been able to save. Meanwhile, Thorne's fall dragged a whole chain of hidden truths into the open, and when the police dug deeper into the plot to abduct the child, they traced the connection between him and Preston Hale. Discovered the envelope of money and the suspicious payments that had made a representative of justice betray his own ideals. Hale was suspended, investigated, and all the accusations he had built against Lane immediately collapsed because they were proven to be the product of corruption and conspiracy. Lane's guardianship file was reviewed one final time, and this time, with a completely lawful income from the Nadia and Whitney Foundation, where she had been invited to work, with a stable and transparent home, with testimony from Maeve and many others about her character. The court officially granted her permanent custody of Whitney, cleanly, fully, with no shadow left hanging over it. The night Lane held that final decision in her hands, she sat beside Whitney's bed as the little girl slept deeply, listening to her peaceful, steady breathing. And for the first time in so many years, she no longer felt the familiar fear lurking at the edge of her happiness, because she knew that this time everything was real, everything was solid, everything belonged to them completely and deservedly. 1 year after that fateful night in the warehouse by the river, on a golden autumn afternoon, the garden of a new home, warm and filled with laughter, instead of the coldness of the old mansion, rang with the running footsteps of a healthy little girl. Whitney was now 9 years old, her cheeks rosy, the asthma attacks of the past well controlled thanks to proper treatment, and she was chasing a butterfly between the flower beds she had planted with the very man she had once said only needed someone so he wouldn't have to be sad alone. Killiorn, no longer the crime lord who had made the whole city tremble, but the head of a charitable foundation that had changed the lives of hundreds of families, sat on the porch steps watching the child with a smile no one would have believed that face could carry years earlier. And beside him was Lane, the woman who had entered his life as a maid bought by an offer, but had stayed through something no money could ever buy. They came together not because of the contract from long ago, not because of an exchange between power and survival, but because amid all the darkness and danger, two wounded people with similar scars had found healing in each other, and Lane's love, patient and decent, had done what violence, money, and fear had failed to do for so many years. It had pulled a man who had seemed completely lost back into the light. When dusk settled and Whitney ran over to tumble into both their arms, 3 people who had each been lonely in their own way now sat together like a real family. And that was the gentlest proof of what this story hopes to share, that no one is forever defined by the worst thing they have done, or by the harshest circumstance they have fallen into. That a person's dignity does not lie in the money in their pocket or the reputation they carry in the world, but in whether someone is willing to look deeply enough at them to believe they are still worth saving. And sometimes, a small act of kindness, a measure of respect offered to a human being when they are at the very bottom, is powerful enough to change an entire life and crack open even the most hardened hearts. Life always gives us a chance to choose between turning away and reaching out, between judgment and understanding, and every kind choice, no matter how small, can be the beginning of something far greater than we imagine. If the story of Lane, Whitney, and Killiorn has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that every day you can join us in listening to many more moving and meaningful stories. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story, which moment moved you the most, and what lesson you have taken for yourself. So please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always treasure every line of your thoughts. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment, and may everyone watching this video always have truly good health, a joyful life, peace, and love each day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.